Well, we can now return to our guest from the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Tamara Alrifai is a spokesperson for UNRWA. She joins us now from Amman in Jordan. Tamara, you work for a humanitarian UN agency, and I want to ask you about this so-called humanitarian city that the Israelis are talking about. How does that measure up against humanitarian principles?
I work with the largest humanitarian organization in Gaza, and calling it humanitarian city is almost an insult to the humanitarian principles, because there is nothing humanitarian or humane about seeking to confine first 600,000, but then the entirety of the population in Gaza into a space that is highly vetted by the Israeli forces. That essentially moves Gaza, previously known as the largest open-air prison in the world, to the most confined, the most overpopulated open-air prison in the world, where the freedom of movement and the access of Gazans in and out of that place is completely regulated by the government of Israel. Nothing humanitarian or humane about it.
Let me ask you about what this might look like in practice. The idea that the entire population of Gaza could be housed in the ruins of Rafah, is that even feasible, possible?
It is not feasible given the level of destruction in Gaza. It is not feasible given the level of exhaustion of Gazans, and mostly it is not feasible given the collapse of the humanitarian action in Gaza, in the sense that since before the collapse of the ceasefire, since early March, there has almost not been any humanitarian, and when I say humanitarian, this is the United Nations, the Red Cross, the established humanitarian. There have not been any supplies going in. Very, very few humanitarian trucks have made it in. And instead, the international principled humanitarian community is being replaced by a so-called mechanism that, instead of giving Gazans food, is actually killing Gazans while they queue for food. So with the lack of expertise, with the lack of supplies, with the high level of desperation and anxiety, but mostly with the relentless bombardment, 21 months minus 2 brief ceasefires, the situation, I've heard it on your program a few minutes ago, is apocalyptic.
Tamara, you were just describing there, when you were talking about this remaining framework for the distribution, that the non-humanitarian one, you were referring to the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who've had many, many people killed at their sites while waiting for food. When you look at the geography of where their sites are, 1 at the Netzarim corridor, really in central Gaza, and 3 in the south, it feels a little bit like the location of those sites have laid the groundwork for this, to push people or attract people, draw them further south towards Rafah.
And that seems to tally with the plan that we heard about. And that continues to be forced displacement of people in Gaza. On average, 90% of the people of Gaza have been displaced, on average 10 times, losing everything along the way. Had it not been for UNRWA and our ability to still reach people where they are, with medical services, with food when we're able to get food in, and with other supplies, the situation would have been much, much worse. But we fear that now, with that almost full blockade, full siege on the international principled humanitarian systems, no trucks are going in. We fear that the worst may still come if there is a worst possible in Gaza.
Tamara, part of this idea of setting up this zone on the ruins of Rafah is that international organizations would be the ones responsible for looking after the hundreds of thousands of people. What sort of provision would need to be made for that? Has anyone reached out to discuss this, for instance, with the United Nations?
The United Nations, at its highest level, the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, has rejected that the plan, the system, the Gaza Humanitarian or Non-Humanitarian Foundation What we're saying is we have an international system that is guided by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, independence. Like, these are established principles. We are experienced. The UN, the Red Cross movement, the different INGOs have worked together in all disaster areas and wars in the world. Why are we seeking to undermine? Why is an entity, a country, the government of Israel, backed by the US, seeking to undermine that system, if not as a continuation of the forced displacement and the forced uprooting and moving of Gazans into, as you said it, and as the plan said it, the ruins of Rafah. Everything is destroyed, and yet it is called a humanitarian city. A city is where people live, where they sleep, where their children go to school, where hospitals function, where there's freedom of movement. This is not a humanitarian city. It's not a city.
Tamara Alrifai, spokesperson for UNRWA. Thank you so much for joining us again on the Al Jazeera NewsHour, Tamara.